So congratulations. If you've made it to this video, that means you made it through the first unit, the science. And now it's time for me to introduce the second unit, our unit on ethics. As we have already seen in our discussion with Greg Jenkins on Friday, science is fundamental to any discussion of climate ethics. We simply have to have that foundation in knowing the facts of the matter before we can talk about what we should be doing about it. And yet ethics requires its own understanding. There are many aspects of ethics, of critical thinking, that will be essential to master before we can get to the business of talking about ethics and thinking about ethics ethically with one another. In this short video, I'm going to introduce the topic for our unit and give you a bit of an overview of what we intend to do for this unit, and then also talk about our big project for this unit, the discussion project.
So today we'll be defining ethics. We'll be talking about some of the unspoken norms that surround our discussion and understanding of ethics. And then I want to prepare you for entering into a discussion, a beginning discussion with students on Monday. So the general overview, we're already started with connecting ethics to climate change. This is something we've been discussing for quite a bit. And of course, we had the opportunity to talk with Greg Jenkins on Friday. We want to focus here, when we think about this, that the benefit of ethics is systemic, critical, and creative thinking. So these are three keywords from the reading for today. Please pay attention to these. We're going to be developing these quite a bit and continuing to talk about systemic, critical, and creative thinking. We will then move to philosophical and religious points of view. Later this week on Friday, we'll be having a discussion with Dr. Ted Toadvine, who is the director of the Rock Ethics Institute. It's not about the ethics of rock. Doug and Julie Rock were the ones who funded the Ethics Institute, so it's called the Rock Ethics Institute, and then more generally about Penn State's involvement in research and teaching on ethics. We want to focus, I think the most important contribution here is moral vision. We think that science is fundamental to our understanding of climate change, but unless we have a vision of what we want to do, what we want the world to be, it is useless to simply understand the science. To move forward to address this problem, we have to have a larger vision. And I find here that Pope Francis is particularly useful in offering us a moral vision that is coherent and complete, and maybe very different than one that you've thought of before, certainly a different one than the economists like Nordhaus have presented to us. And then a culmination of this unit will be the conversation project. This is something that we'll spend a fair amount of time preparing you for, but you are going to undertake a conversation with 3 or 4 other people, not members of this class, and talk with them about climate change. Don't worry, we'll have lots of time to discuss what that's all about and what the write-up is for that and the expectations later on in the semester. So why ethics? Our objectives for this week help us to see that the focus for now is on fruitful ethical thinking and discussion, that ethics offers us opportunities to engage the world and to improve the world. So this is fundamentally why ethics is important here. We are not talking about any particular form of ethics. There are a wide variety of ethical ways to approach issues, as we will see. It's not a matter of having a clear answer about what the step is forward, but about the process of thinking through the ethical way forward. There are, of course, throughout our experience, we'll run into professional ethicists all over. We have seen this, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ethicists talking about who should receive the vaccines first, and judging that I, for example, have not yet received the vaccine. You probably have not received the vaccine, because when vaccine is in short supply, it should go first to those who will most benefit from it. And those are people who are living in group homes, the elderly, but also people who are in jail, who have no opportunity to escape the constant press of other people around them. Whereas I can teach you comfortably from my own home. So it would not be ethical for me to go ahead of the line of somebody who is far more at risk for disease. So this kind of professional ethics we see in medicine, we see it also in law and engineering and politics. Believe it or not, there are ethics of politics, there are ethics of war. So these people are professionals who spend all their time thinking through these ethical problems and working them out. That has a real effect on society. But ethics also more generally we'll find in life. Every profession has to think about ethics. It's terribly important for me as a professor to treat you, the students, ethically. And for anybody who is in position of authority to think about ethics and ethical treatment. But one of the problems here that we find in this kind of professional ethics is that ethics just becomes a series of hoops to jump through for many professions. It just becomes a pain. Because I have to be ethical, that means I've got to fill out all these forms for human resources, for example. But the efficient way through is often not the same as the ethical way through. You can think of it as being, it's just more efficient to fill out these forms and get through it, but that doesn't involve the thinking, the critical observation, the consideration for others that is really part of ethical thought. So we should think about the ethical implications of our actions, even where we're not forced to do so by human resources, for example. And then, of course, our interrelationships with one another, whether that is our romantic partners or our colleagues or our family. What are the right ethical ways to respond to each other in particularly difficult situations, but also in everyday life? I've been talking with my niece, for example, who is a bank teller, who was in tears because of the way that people were treating her. Of course, they're stressed, there's a pandemic, but it's not ethical to treat a bank teller in a way that is not caring about her personal feelings. So ethics is involved in every aspect of our relationship with other people. And certainly that it spreads out to democracy. As a democracy, we must engage with others, even those with whom we disagree, and we must find solutions to the problems that face us all. What ethics allows here is for you to articulate your ideas, to identify your values, and also to be able to listen to the values of others so that you can engage them more directly in democratic deliberation. Now, we have a definition of ethics from Anthony Weston, and this is a useful place for us to begin. There are many reasons why he's chosen this definition, but let's just start and jump right in and consider what he's put before us. And that is, ethics is taking care for the basic needs and legitimate expectations of others, as well as our own. There's only a few words here, and it may be worth your while to simply memorize these so that you start to pay attention to each of these words. As we'll see, one of the fundamental aspects of philosophical ethics and philosophy in general is words and definitions. And no words actually are really very simple. All of them are quite complicated. And the process of defining, of thinking what these words mean and imply, and what others might think of when they hear these words, this process is a central process to philosophical ethics. This other orientation is fundamental to ethics. If you're just alone on an island, can you even act ethically if there aren't other people around? I mean, there may be a way to act ethically compared to the plants and animals on that island, but you must be concerned about others. In this, fundamentally, in this definition, is the presumption that it is unethical to worry only about yourself. To think about you and nobody else and nothing else in the world is, by this definition, unethical. Now, of course, like everything in philosophy, we could argue this point, but I want you to pay attention to that. The self is included in this, legitimate expectations of others as well as our own. It's not a matter of no self, right? You are important in this, and your needs and expectations are important. But fundamentally, this is about other people. Taking care, Anthony Weston has quite a long discussion of what this means, and do pay attention to this because he has 3 different ways of thinking about taking care. So don't presume you automatically know what this is or what basic needs are, or indeed what legitimate expectations are. So we've got quite a bit of work to do in these first couple of weeks, thinking through this definition and understanding the implications of all these terms. And of course, there's the question of who is the other? As I suggested already with my desert island example, it's not necessarily just other human beings, but perhaps we want to also consider animals. Do they have a full right? Do plants or trees have a right to be a part of the ethical community? The question of others also is a question of who counts. Some voices in our human society are louder than others. Some speak with more authority than others. Some people have no voice because perhaps of some sort of disability or because society purposely does not listen to them.
Indeed, as we go through the history of philosophy, we find that for the great Greek philosophers, for example, women had no voice at all. Women were not considered to be rational creatures. And that legacy continues on even to today, where you will find these presumptions about women and women's voices as being somehow less legitimate than those of men. And of course, we can talk about this in terms of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people. We can talk about this in terms of African Americans or members of other racial minorities. Who counts and who has to be discussed in an ethical situation is something that is central and really important for us to consider.
I want to suggest to you that all of this abstract thinking is really almost irrelevant. We must engage in practice in order to understand ethical situations. That's one of the reasons why the culmination of this unit is a practice. It is you going out and engaging in a discussion with others. And one of these ethical practices that happens right here on campus is thon. It's worthwhile to think just for a few minutes how thon is an ethical activity. And I encourage you, if you're watching this on perusal, to take a moment and put some comments in the side here. Consider, is thon ethical? How is it ethical? How does it fit our definition of ethics? And of course, we are not exploring these ethical issues in a vacuum. This is something that is happening within a particular context, our context here in the US. And there are some unspoken norms about this context. One is what I call whiteness. This is a technical term, does not necessarily have to do with the white racial identity, but it is a larger category for us to think about what we think is true and good. What is the background norm? And one example of this is the fact that for a long time, medical experiments were only done on middle-aged white men. And so the efficacy of any particular cancer drug, for example, would have been tested out on the white male physiology, but then it might act very differently in members of racial minorities or in women. This was the norm. This is how things are defined as natural or as true. So we want to try to pay attention to our own presumptions that are very difficult to see. Christianity is one of these in the US. Even if you are not Christian or do not adhere to any religious tradition, Christianity forms a powerful background to discussions of what is true and what is good. the issues of why we're here, of what life is all about, are influenced by Christian stories. Many people, even if they're not Christian, will still know the story of Noah and the ark, or will know the story about Jesus and the cross. These are things that structure the way we see reality. And part of this is the human need to tell stories, that we communicate our sense of ourselves, our vision for where we're going in a society through these stories and through these common stories. So to share these stories, to share this history, is to engage in conversations. But what of those who don't have these stories, or for whom the stories are quite different? To just assume that everybody knows about Jesus and his mission in first century Palestine is to assume whiteness, is to assume that everybody is like me. And so we want to be very careful about those kinds of presumptions. And then there is the presumption of what it means to be American. We have seen this powerfully on display in the last election cycle, that this idea of we are the ones who fight, right? This is something that has a particular resonance with the Capitol, but it's also a matter of how we face cancer. We honor those who fight cancer. And someone who decides to forego treatment somehow doesn't fit this narrative. It's not normal. The normal thing is to fight, to be in control of our destiny. And of course, this runs into very great difficulties when we aren't in control of our destiny, which is quite often. We also have this sense of Americans as rugged individuals, the image of the cowboy, alone on the range and in control of his own destiny. And make no mistake, the rugged individual we're talking about is a male, probably a middle-aged male, and probably white. These are particular notions of masculinity, and masculinity tied up with American sense of self. And this distrust of authority, I hope you all enjoy the image here, because yeah, I am a geek. But this concept that what it means to be an American is not to trust authority. Again, we see in the election cycle, we see with attitudes toward COVID-19 and public masking. This is very different than other societies where there is a trust in authority. And we can only look to places like New Zealand or Australia, or where people believe in their system of healthcare, and that those who are making these decisions are doing it for the best for all people. We don't have that in the US. This is not what it means to be American. Now, again, I'm not talking about any individual. I'm not talking about what you as an individual American might think. What I'm talking about are unspoken norms. If you do not believe these things, then you're already starting at a disadvantage in the common conversation. You're swimming against the stream. This stream of whiteness, this stream of unspoken norms, can make ethical discussions very difficult, especially if you have a new or different idea. So let's talk about our job for Monday. And a little bit different in this unit is that we're going to be spending more time paying close attention to readings and discussing them in your research pods. Now, what I mean by preparing a reading for discussion, it's not just a matter of getting the information or making sure that you have the chemical formulas correct. What you want to do is to interrogate these readings. And the two particular readings we have to look at are stories by Alice Walker and Ted Kerasote. When you're reading these stories, you can certainly enjoy the narrative and get into the story. They're both very engaging, but then think about them. Ask yourself questions about what are the presumptions here? How do authors challenge our ideas of what should and should not be the case? Because both of them, you'll see, are very much challenging your presumptions. The stories are also concerned about ethics and concerned about environment. So think about the way that these stories are engaging those issues and look at our definition of taking care, basic needs, legitimate expectations, and others. How are those represented in the story? And then do you agree with the way it's represented, or is there some issue there? The point here is not to come up with a specific answer, right? And this can be very frustrating for those of you who are more used to the sciences. It's not a matter of there being a specific answer. It's a matter of having a fruitful discussion about these and using these stories as a basis for us to think through fundamental issues on our own. Then when you have done that, think about some larger issues about the story. Does the story frame a discussion in such a way that leaves something out that maybe is unfair in a way? Again, when we talked briefly about the issue of framing earlier in the semester, looking at paintings and thinking about the way Richard Alley frames his discussion, we started to come into this process of the question of stories and how stories set us up to come to a conclusion. But maybe that's not fair, maybe that's not right. And so think about the way that the story sets things up, think about specific issues, way things are represented in stories, and use that to get into discussions of ethics in your research pods. Looking ahead for this week, of course, on Monday we have discussions of readings. Wednesday we'll be back to presentation papers in your research pods that we've had as usual, but there's a bit of a twist because now we are going to have a meeting, a webinar on Friday with Ted Toadvine, who is the director of the Rock Ethics Institute. And we'll engage in a broader discussion with Dr. Toadvine about Penn State and ethics, specifically the different forms of research and education that the Ethics Institute funds and supports. There'll be quizzes on March 8th and 24th. I'll talk more about those when we get closer to those dates. And then at the end of March, we'll have that conversation project. So that's the overview of this unit on ethics. And as you can surmise, this is something that I really enjoy talking about. The ethics aspect of this is both very difficult, but also extremely rewarding. And I look forward to working with you in this unit.